Why have you spent your life and career fighting on these issues related to social justice?
The last 20 to 30 years, we've seen a transformation in opportunities for young people in that area, precisely because different parts of society decided to work together. I think sometimes there's positive stories need to be told.
Yeah.
When we talk about social justice and the fight for the rights of a number of groups, the challenges can feel so big and so huge and so daunting that it's easy to go, well, what can I do? What can we do? Maybe this is just how it has to be.
Lewis Iru, CEO and co-founder of Purpose Union, specialises in advising organisations on social and environmental impact. With 15 years of experience, he's worked with influential entities like Unilever, the United Nations and Formula One. In 2021, he co-authored a masterclass with Malala on achieving social change. Previously, Lewis directed the Fair Education Alliance and worked at corporate reputation agencies Finsbury and Brunswick. He's contributed to publications like The Economist, The Guardian, The Times, The Telegraph, The Independent and The New Statesman, and has made numerous TV appearances. Lewis has also given a TEDx talk about social mobility. He is a trustee at the British Red Cross and holds an honorary doctorate from the University of East London. He studied politics, philosophy and economics at New College, Oxford, where he was president of the Oxford University Student Union.
For you, what are the methods, give us a sense of the kind of methods you believe are necessary for achieving social justice.
So I always say, one of the key skills is being able to have the panoramic view on what's happening locally, regionally, nationally, globally, that might be related to that issue, because it sits in that sort of broader context. So, and how does that affect, how can I analyze that and work out what is working, what works for the cause I care about, and what's pushing against the cause I care about. So I think that's an important skill.
All right, thank you so much, Lewis, for joining us at the School of Social Justice video podcast. This is our second season. I'm so glad to have you here, particularly as someone who I've known for years, who I've seen shine on different stages and set the example for so many of your peers like myself, as well as the next generation of people who want to make a difference. I've seen you kind of join us at some of our events in the past, talking about some of the major social injustices. And I've also seen and witnessed the organisations you've led and the change you've brought about. So thank you so much for joining. I can't wait to share all of the lessons you've learned, your wisdom and experience with our students at the School of Social Justice.
Welcome. Thanks for having me. And I've similarly it's been great to follow the work you've been doing, and always enjoy when we have a chance to talk about this type of stuff. So thanks for having me.
Amazing. I think last time we actually sat down was watching a Man United game where I think you beat Liverpool, so that was a bit
so.
of a...
I think, if I recall, that's a correct reading of that game. But I won't. I know sort of our clubs are in different trajectories at the moment, so I won't needle you too much about Liverpool.
Sort of a kind of injustice there in the football world. But listen, to start off with, it would be great to kind of learn a bit about yourself. As I kind of alluded to, you have been a world champion in debating. You advise so many companies right now and non-profits on how they can communicate the change that they're making and want to achieve. Tell us a bit about yourself and what you're up to now as the CEO of Purpose Union.
Yeah, going back a bit, I've always believed, one, in the importance of social justice as a mission, two, in the belief that actually businesses can actually be part of the constellation of organizations who can actually fight for social justice and bring their unique perspectives and assets to the table. And three, that we need to get better at helping different parts of society work together in order to achieve social justice. And so all of that had, led me to working in education policy for a bit, led me into sort of advising companies in various guises over the years. And now at Purpose Union, which me and sort of my colleagues Barry Johnson and Daniel Flores set up now almost 5 years ago, our focus is on helping organizations make the positive change in the world, whilst at the same time benefiting those organizations. And we think there's a win-win there. And so we use the power of strategy and communications to really sort of bring that about.
Amazing. I mean, you talk about the importance of bringing different organizations of people from different sectors to work on social justice. I mean, when we talk about social justice, what does it mean to you?
Yeah, I mean, you can go out there and find a number of different definitions of social justice, and in many ways, people will come at it based on their own personal circumstances and journeys, and obviously areas of expertise. For me, it's about the equitable distribution of opportunity, no matter who you are, what part of the country you're from, what part of the world you're from. It's the idea that actually everyone deserves an equal shot at life and opportunities, and social justice is about trying to get to a situation we are from where we are now to that end state, and everything in between, that struggle, for me is what the core of social justice is about. It's about opportunity and access to opportunity for me.
And as someone who, both of us come from the same place, born and raised in Newham, East London, one of the places which often, is such a beautiful place in terms of diversity in people there, many migrant families, people who speak different languages and are from different parts of the world. Often migrant families who come here to work in search of a better life. But also, unfortunately, sometimes tops and does well in bad indicators around crime, poverty rates and inequality. For you, as someone who's also born or raised in a similar area, same area, why have you spent your life and career fighting on these issues related to social justice?
Yeah, I mean, you see it up close, and sort of, as you said, that part of the world is an area with so much vibrancy, so much creativity, amazing people, but historically have faced a lot of challenges. It is quite representative of some of the challenges lots of societies face, right? In terms of opportunities for young people, crime, chronic lack of investment in many areas as well. But at the same time, what's great about the area is the ingenuity. Actually, over the last 20 to 30 years, we've seen a transformation in opportunities for young people in that area, precisely because different parts of society decided to work together. Now it's got some of the best educational outcomes in the country, and that's a result of sort of a real focus on the area. I'm passionate about education. A real focus on getting the best teachers in those schools, getting extracurricular activities in those schools, getting businesses to work effectively in those schools as well. And so for me, I think is an example of what you can do and how you can get it right, even if it feels like the problems are insurmountable. And I think sometimes those positive stories need to be told. When we talk about social justice and the fight for the rights of a number of groups, the challenges can feel so big and so huge and so daunting that it's easy to go, well, what can I do? What can we do? Maybe this is just how it has to be. And I think one of the things that I'm particularly focused on at the moment is helping people to tell those positive stories, not to paper over the cracks that exist, but to give people hope. Because my worry is sometimes things can be so hard, people feel defeated, and we can't have that happen.
It's definitely something which is necessary, particularly when we're talking about issues which can often be quite, really serious and often saddening at best, and to give people reasons for believing something is possible and change is possible is definitely important. I think your story and your push is definitely something which is necessary within the world of trying to make a difference. I mean, let's talk about those methods, because as we alluded to, you've played a role in many different kinds of organizations, and also as an individual, from a debater, as well as somebody who teaches debate to people and led many winning championship teams, to then leading an organization related to education, and now advising businesses, and, as I say, using public speaking and writing to push forward the needle on these kinds of very tough issues. For you, what are the methods, give us a sense of the kind of methods you believe are necessary for achieving social justice.
So it's a good question, and I think the first is just appreciating and understand the world out there. And I think sometimes it's quite easy. You see this a lot you've got a particular issue or campaign that you're really passionate about, for you to see that in isolation. And you've got a ton of vision. I care about making change on this issue, and that passion is important. But that issue sits in a wider context. So I always say, one of the key skills is being able to have that panoramic view of what's happening, locally, regionally, nationally, globally, that might be related to that issue, because it sits in that sort of broader context. So if I'm passionate about fighting childhood obesity, for example, okay, what's happening in sort of the broader conversation about healthcare? We need a broader conversation about young people and skills. Indeed, what's happening politically? What's happening economically? And how does that affect? How can I analyze that and work out what is working, what works for the cause I care about, and what's pushing against the cause I care about? So I think that's an important skill. I think being able to also break down the problem that you're trying to solve. So if there's a particular policy area that you think is instrumental to sort of creating social justice, again, let's take, for example, closing the education gap.
Okay.
What are the root causes of that challenge, and how would you break that down and analyze it in a way that allows you to go, okay, there are probably 7 main causes. Yeah. I'm going to work together with people to try and attack causes 1, 2, and 5, right?
Okay.
And so it's about being quite methodological. Otherwise, you're just doing stuff for the sake of doing stuff. 2 more things. One is, I think it's really important to work in coalition with people and work together. For me, the most successful movements that we've seen have been able to bring together a really interesting church of people who all bring different assets and skills to the table. It's very difficult to do it in isolation, and I think that's a really important skill, and it's actually underrated, bringing people together. And finally, what are your best arguments, and test them? Being able to sort of construct a case that actually takes into consideration that wider context I talked about earlier on, takes into consideration the problems that you've analysed, also the information, the intelligence, the views and perspectives of that coalition you've built. How are you crafting a really compelling story that says, this is the problem, this is what's going to have to happen for that problem to stop being a problem, and this is what the world looks like once we've tackled the problem. And that storytelling, that crafting of an argument, for me is absolutely critical. So those are there are others as well, but for me, if you've got those skills nailed down, you're in a good place in terms of being able to sort of go off and fight for change.
That's a really impressive kind of sample of the kinds of tactics, strategies that people can use. As you say, take a step back, seek information for the panoramic view, break down problems into issues that become a little bit more manageable, build coalitions of diverse groups of people and organizations, and finally craft a story. I think those 4 things will be great to kind of go into a bit more depth. Maybe we could start actually with an example. Do you have an example of where you've worked on a particular issue which has then led to some change at the end?
Yeah, one of the things that so I was the director of the Fair Education Alliance a number of years ago, and the whole mission was to close the education gap in the UK. If you're a young person, you come from a free school meals background, you are, according to a number of metrics, less likely to succeed in the education system, and that's unfair. So that was our whole premise. Now, at the time, the Prime Minister was Theresa May, and one of her policy platforms was to expand grammar schools. And we had quite a lot of evidence to suggest that grammar schools actually would exacerbate the gap. Because there's a particular type of family that will be able to succeed in passing the 11 plus. They would suck resources, including teachers from different parts of the country. It would mentally send a signal that if you haven't made it into that school, then you're a failure. There are lots of reasons why I think it goes against the principles of social justice. So one of the immediate things we had to do was to quickly build a coalition of people to try and argue against this. And our coalition involved businesses, trade unions, teaching groups, parental groups, universities. It was a really interesting array of people that we were able to sort of do things like put in joint letters, for example, in newspapers, or make representations to ministers and MPs who were wavering. We conducted a series of debates across the country because we wanted to involve communities in this conversation. And, you know, in the spirit of the debate, we invited people who cared passionately about this as well. We had a series of spokespeople who were able to go on the Today programme, for example, and make the case against it, knowing our core audience would listen to programmes like the Today programme. So we used a mixture of sort of mobilisation, crafting our messaging, and deploying that message in sort of targeted ways to sort of really sort of block this proposal from happening. But also, at the same time, we were able to use the heft, the intellectual heft around the coalition to build an alternative. Like, if you didn't have to go down with ground cells, what's the alternative? Because often it's quite easy to say we don't want something, but what do you have in its place? And so we were able to, again, portray a positive view of what a comprehensive system which is well invested in, which both teachers and young people thrived would look like. And so that was the alternative to fight for. And that together meant, we, you know, also being fortunate that the political dynamics changed after the 2017 general election, meant that we were able to essentially win that argument and stop that proposal from happening.
You've used the words argument, narrative, storytelling. You've also written a book, Words That Win. Clearly, the craft of using words to push forward progress has been such a part of your work. Can you kind of enlighten us to how you came to the conclusion that storytelling and narrative was important? You know, was there a moment you realized actually this stuff works, particularly when you've got a context of people saying, look, I'm fed up of just talking, I'm fed up of just speaking, when actually so much of democratic progress has happened through conversation and dialogue. And then maybe give us insights into like your personal process. Like, what does Lewis Iwudu do in order to face a problem? You know, do you write things down as notes? Do you have conversations? Do you spend days and days thinking in your room, in your office? So yeah, maybe a bit about the moment when you realize words can make a difference, and then secondly, a bit of like the very practical day-to-day stuff where you use words to win.
I don't think there was a particular moment.
Okay.
You know, it was, yeah, it's an ongoing process, and obviously this practice has been around for thousands of years. But you know, I always felt that there's nothing more powerful than people who want to make change and will benefit from the change speaking for themselves. And my parents were a member of various organisations that they dragged me to as a young person, including what was then known as Telco. And so, you know,
your parents were active in community organising?
They you know, they weren't on the forefront of it, but they were very interested in it. They're of Nigerian heritage. They obviously congregated as a diaspora, especially as people moved over, especially as they moved over from Nigeria, and sort of came together and discussed and talked about issues that faced them here, politics back in Nigeria. So I've always seen people standing up as a young person and using words as a way of trying to sort of advance social progress. So that was a slow burn for me.
Okay.
But at the same time, you know, I think as I got older, what I noticed was great initiatives and campaigns which I think had the right intentions. They were clearly getting at something, but for various reasons, there was a mismatch between what they were saying and the moment, or indeed the people they were trying to speak to, and the communication and the craft of trying to tell a story just wasn't quite right. And at the end of the day, stories are absolutely important. That's how we are persuaded, as opposed to a series of facts or statements that we kind of might see loosely. The ability to weave a story is actually could be the difference between persuading people to act or not. And so for me, it's always been an integral part of the way I've approached it. Of course, it's not the sole thing that matters, but it's incredibly important. If you take let's take, for example, the big conversation about whether or not businesses should kind of use their influence and platforms for social and environmental good. Now you have a group of people who say businesses shouldn't do that. It's woke capitalism gone too far, and they're being very vocal. Now, my view is progressive businesses, and indeed the people who call themselves progressive, who want to see social change and believes businesses can play a role in that, we have to get better at making the argument back and find the right arguments and the right way of framing those arguments. Otherwise, sort of the anti-woke, the anti-sort of progressive sort of coalition are much more likely to dominate the conversation. And so for me, that's a very good example of where the selection of arguments, the way in which you make those arguments and the way you frame those arguments actually can make a big difference to whether or not businesses run scared from actually engaging with the stuff. And quite frankly, they need to engage with the stuff. On climate change, on racial justice, on sort of labour rights, a whole host of issues. We need businesses to be much more bullish, quite frankly, and not afraid. So for me, it's a long burn, and that's what matters. That's why it matters to me. In terms of my personal process, look, I'm a big fan of a couple of things. One is I hope I'm humble enough to know that I definitely don't have all the answers. I hardly have any of them, to be honest. I might have a structure and a way of thinking about them. I think it's really important to talk to people.
Okay. Yeah.
And I think it's really important to listen to people. And there are people who've been doing the hard yards on an issue for a very long time. There are people who would be direct beneficiaries of a change in policy, and listening to their experience is really, really important. And that includes also learning from other campaigns from completely different fields. So I like to read and immerse myself and actually just go out to the field and talk to people.
How many people do you speak to, say, in a given day or week, and how many books do you, or things do you read? I mean, so just as estimate, because there's many people out there who are like, well, what does it really take? The very specifics, do you read 1,000 books a year?
No, I don't read that. I don't read that. And look, you can read 3 books that might be transformational, 300, right? It doesn't. I don't think it's about the number of books or indeed the number of people. It's about reading something that adds to the way you see a problem and the way you see a solution. And it will be different for different people. But I do think you need to do that. You do need the bandwidth to be able to do that, right? So being able to sort of carve out time where you're away from the noise, where you might switch off your phone or whatever, and just be in the moment and really absorb what you read or what you listen to or who you listen to, I think is important. I'm a big fan of writing stuff down.
Okay.
And I'm a very visual person, so I will, if, let's say a client comes to me and says that there's this particular social issue that we really want to grapple with. In fact, I'll give you an example. One of my old teachers reached out to me. I haven't seen her for 20 years.
Wow.
And she said, there's this particular social challenge that I really want to really wrestle with, and I want to do something on. And I'll get together a group of people, get some resources and do something. Could you give me some pointers? And for me, the first thing I did was get my pen and paper out and just kind of sketch, like, okay, what are all the forces affecting this particular problem? Who are the key stakeholders? Like, how could we start to map out like a theory of change? So what would doing X mean for Y, and what would Y mean for Z, all the way to the problem? And even if it's like unstructured, even if it's just like stuff that comes into your head, I like to have it down on a piece of paper and start to kind of draw links and knock stuff out. And I'll go, okay, that doesn't really make sense given what we know about the problem. Actually, that's something quite interesting there. And actually, there's a kernel of truth in this thing. You start to basically draw connections. So that's kind of very personal to me. I like to see stuff mapped out, and then I can begin to kind of see a pattern and potentially see an idea. And something that could be a creative way of tackling this challenge and this problem. And then obviously then test it and then whatever, and it might lead to nothing. But for me, that's how the creative process works. So I need I need the input, and that's the people and the things I read and what I immerse myself with. I also kind of need the ability to kind of convert that into some loose set of thoughts and then apply structure to it as well. The fun thing is assuming I've got I'm pretty clear what I want to do. I just need to come up with some arguments, and I have this. I mention this in the book. I think there is a structured way to thinking about arguments, which maximizes the chances of that argument being successful in terms of persuading someone.
How so?
So, I think all good arguments have 4 parts. There's their headline. So what is this argument in 3 to 5 words? If you could sum it up in 3 to 5 words. There's the explanation bit, which is why is that headline true and how can I substantiate it? There's the illustration. So how can I bring this example from what is quite some theoretical point to something that's much more tangible? So a story, an illustration, a statistic, a hypothetical example, case study, and then finally impact. Why should I, as someone listening to this, care? You put that all together, and that's almost the anatomy of an argument. And so for me, that I use that, I quite literally would write headline, explanation, illustration, impact to make sure I've ticked all those off. I think it's just a structured way of thinking about persuasion.
No, I love that framework, and I think I'm going to start using that as well. And I feel like for anybody who's starting off, it makes it a lot more simple to think about. Write down those headlines, put some thoughts down on paper, and see where we go. I think what I really appreciated about you sharing in your process is the fact that you didn't, in order for you to know what you thought, you wrote it down, and then you saw what worked, what didn't in that first draft, and you drafted it alongside people, and then kind of did the other part of the work, which then to kind of put it together in a solid framework of action later. But those 4 headlines, I think, will be very helpful to the students. Talking about story, do you have a story or an example which has inspired you personally? Maybe not work you did, or maybe you worked alongside somebody where, or it might be an example of history, where you've seen social justice happen, and it's something where you look at as almost like a model for change.
Yeah, no, it's a very good question. I mean, for me, and it's maybe a bit of an obvious example, but I always been intrigued by the civil rights movement, and not necessarily the sort of, I mean, of course, the main figures in it, but also the organisers behind the scenes. For example, the organisers behind the March on Washington, and how much, just logistically, what it took to pull that off, and the various sort of machinations that had to happen with the government to make sure that what was a very significant symbolic moment in the civil rights struggle was pulled off almost flawlessly. I'm very interested I was in student politics at university. I'm very interested in the role of the student movement in sort of civil rights struggle as well. And then finally, what I think you saw, and this links in with what we've just said, in that period, some amazing orators who are able to acknowledge how difficult things were, but to relentlessly think about the vision, right? What are we working towards? What does that look like? I'm going to give you a taste of what it could be. And I want to reiterate, I think sometimes we leave that bit out. We diagnose the problem, we're very good at admiring the problem and the challenge, and actually we're getting better at coming up with solutions and talking about them, but I think we can't miss out what is that visioning bit, and actually spell it out for people. I think in the context of today in the UK, if I look, it's a common thing I come up time and time again, people are tired. And this sort of stuff is quite heavy, and I think weighs on people heavily. And the morale and keeping people engaged and inspired and excited for change is something that I think a lot of leaders at that time got, which is really I think really fascinating. A more modern example for me is being inspired by Barack Obama, who given I was at university at the time, that's where my politics was it was becoming, I guess, a bit more sophisticated. I was a bit more aware of myself in relation to the world. It just the timing of that was quite significant. And for me, there were two moments or two aspects of Obama's candidacy which I think really kind of inspired me. I think one was the ability to speak above factions. And I think it's a lesson I've taken to heart, which is we may have divisions, but actually let's extract the things that unite us and let me build a pitch based on that. And in doing so, make us realize that the sort of things that split us are not as powerful as the things that unite us. Might sound very simple, but I think it's actually very difficult to do, especially with the rhetorical flourish that he did. And the second thing was with the Reverend Wright issue, the decision to give a speech focused on race, despite the risks that associated with that, I think is a lesson in good leadership comms. Many people would just ignore it or try to bury it with a press release or briefing journalists, etc. I was like, no, I'm actually going to address it head on, and I'm going to own this and speak to it. And for me, I've taken a lesson from that, which is, it is, and I say this to my clients, it is always better to speak to things head on your terms than to let other people dictate the terms. And it may feel uncomfortable, and it probably will. It may feel it's a bit of a distraction, but it inevitably is more powerful and I think more sustainable than you eventually having to do it on the back foot anyway. So for me, I just thought that was on a high level in terms of rhetoric and oratory, I think really, really interesting. But in terms of political strategy and trying to not allow a potential crisis to derail his fight for justice, I think is a powerful example for me.
There's so much in that where we could probably spend a few more episodes talking about those campaigns, the civil rights movement, as well as Barack Obama's historic electoral victory. I think one bit there is around the moment and being able to respond to a crisis. And also, as you said, all of the work that needs to be done in order to be prepared to respond to the crisis. As I said, I would love to speak with you more about the civil rights movement as well as Barack Obama, but just in terms of a moment and responding to crises, do you have an example of a time when you faced a crisis and had to write a speech? I mean, I guess in one way your debating career is an example of you having to respond to people trying to bring down your argument. But I'm just curious, how does one, if people are out there and figuring out, look, I've just seen something which really makes me angry, whether it be a humanitarian disaster, an incident of deep racism, something which happens in your local community, violence, like how do you respond to that, and how have you, for example, used words in order to respond to those moments?
So I guess, one example is, the murder of George Floyd. And I think, for me, I knew I wanted to say something because both, I think, it's an issue I cared about as well. I know a lot of people were also asking me for my thoughts and were interested to hear my take on it. And at the time, if you can recall, there were just lots and lots of panels about it with people with very different takes. And so I decided to sort of kind of offer my perspective, not because I felt I could shape the debate, but I felt I wanted to get stuff off my chest, and I did want to contribute towards the discussion. And for me, it was about being able to clarify what I wanted to say.
Okay.
And actually, using a structured approach, if there were 3 points I wanted to get across, what were they? 3 things for people to take away. But I also wanted to be quite practical, and I wanted to say, look, what does this mean? And for me, it meant that this is a time for people to stand up, and this had to be a moment of we couldn't go back to the way things were. there's had to be an inflection point, and I wanted to convey that quite powerfully. But at the same, the other thing I would say is there's a big debate amongst people when it comes to kind of giving speeches and responding to crises, whether they are external events, events in your own organisation, about the role of emotion.
Role of emotion.
Emotion.
Okay.
You know, what tone should you strike? Should you be angry? Should you be calm? You know, when I work with leaders, I use sort of a matrix, which is basically a firebrand, as the name implies, a statesperson, more of a conversationalist, and a professor. Right? Those are the four kind of tones that often you see deployed.
Firebrand,
statesperson, conversationalist, and a professor.
Okay.
Each can be very, very compelling and powerful. Conventional wisdom is that in a crisis of responding, you've got to be almost like a professor or a statesman. You can't show emotion. And for me, I think sometimes there is a role for emotion. I think sometimes being able to convey what you feel in its rawest is quite powerful, as long as it serves a purpose, as long as you understand what you're trying to achieve. I think it can be quite powerful, and for me, that was probably the most. I'm not going to use the emotional is the wrong word, but the most free form I've spoken in terms of how I feel, and I feel like it was important to do that. So I think if there's any lessons to take from this is the most powerful forms of personal communication, if you're giving a speech or an address or responding to something, especially in the sort of social justice space, is to be able to combine the emotion with the rational, right? And it comes back to the point about storytelling. We're not robots. We don't just process responses and go, okay, fine. We compute it and tally it up in a table and produce a response. The emotion we see in people kind of affects us, but at the same time, it needs to be controlled and structured in a way that allows us to understand it and interpret it as well. So for me, is that balance is really important. It's a balance I've tried to strike a number of times and advise our clients to strike that balance too.
One thing when I've seen leaders, as well as even yourself on stage, is kind of alluding to what you just said about the different types of oratory and styles. It's not only the words in which people use or have written, but also their body language. And as somebody who's trained as a lawyer, who has to meet clients every day in meetings and also stands on stage and has panel debates, for people who are kind of figuring out that level of communication, do you have anything to share about how to kind of analyze as well as be aware of your body language? I mean, I'm aware that whilst we're speaking, I'm now like sitting up straight and so forth, but do you have any kind of advice for people figuring out how to deliver kind of public speaking things and the body language side? Yeah,
I mean, I think there are two things which I think can be done. Well, three things to take into consideration. One is a big caveat, which is people can. There's a tendency, I think, when it comes to public speaking and how you come across, for there to be almost like a set of things that you absolutely should do, and that your body posture has to be like this, or you have to speak at this pace, etc. For me, I don't buy into that. I think a lot of different speaking styles can be very persuasive, and you can tie yourself in knots going, oh my gosh, my body posture was this and not that, or this and not that. The key is variation, and the key is having a strategy. So sometimes actually having a particular body stance or position is advantageous because you want to convey a particular thing at that moment in time. Sometimes you want to be a bit more formal and a bit more kind of straight, right? So as long as you understand what purpose what you're doing at any moment in time is doing, then actually I'm very reluctant to say this or that kind of works. You have to mix it up. But on a very practical level, one is recording yourself, or watching videos of yourself, and I think it's by far for me the easiest way to get people to understand the tics that they have is by literally
Okay.
watching themselves. And it's maybe the first 3 or 4 or 5 times, it's quite cringe and you sort of go, oh gosh, that's me. But you just get used to it after a while. Look, if we think about, we talked about at the start, we're big sports fans. Coaches will get their players and their teams to rewatch videos themselves and go, this wasn't quite right, that's quite right, have you seen this? And you internalize it much more better. The third thing is, similarly, watching videos of other people, actually, and becoming almost, if you want to get better at this stuff, and this stuff I think is integral, if you want to be a leader fighting for social justice, if you want to get better at public speaking, doing panels, etc., is just watch a lot of panels and public speeches, but not watch them from a technical perspective. What techniques are they doing? What are they doing with their body? What are they doing with their voice? How are they using the space? Because sometimes it's easy. It's almost like watching a film. If you watch a film passively as someone who just wants to watch a nice film, you'll see it in a particular way. If you're watching it as someone who wants to be a director, or you're watching it as someone who wants to, work in film, you'll spot things, you'll watch things in a slightly different way. So, become a student of it and actually spend time watching it and breaking it down. I think together those are sort of, very quick wins in terms of being able to get much better at this.
I love that example of the way you can be intentional about how you consume content. Having tried to write a book recently, now when I'm watching a film, I'm thinking about how the scriptwriter and director work together to portray a certain idea or certain feeling. And it's just mind-blowing just in terms of the way you can see one scene as a viewer and as an audience member versus you being a kind of person who wants to develop your craft. So amazing example, and I think our students can take away a lot from that. I'm just aware that time is very short and we've got a hard stop in 7 minutes. For somebody who wants to follow in your footsteps, Lewis, and wants to be a future Lewis Uwu, what kind of skills and advice do you have for them? The real stuff, right? Like not the sort of surface level, work hard, dedication, which of course is very important. I'm just very curious, like what has it taken for you to be able to be a leader within your field and also to inspire others who are your peers and others to kind of do better and keep on fighting?
I think a couple of things. I think one is I've been very lucky that I have had a number of people who maybe haven't been formal mentors, but people who I look up to, who I just use as sounding boards, or I'm very interested in what they're doing, and I kind of almost, I get a sense from them, how do they go about navigating life and problems, and the common thread is they all are passionate about social issues, they all work at it through different ways, whether it's through sitting on boards, or whether it's running their own charities, or whether it's being politicians. And being able to have access to that has been of huge importance to me. And the reason I have that is because I think it's really important to network and to be out there and to show an interest in the wider world. So, getting out there and it's not easy to do. I'm not going to pretend. We could do a whole session on how you build effective networks that you can work with to deliver change. But they've both been a source of inspiration, but also a source of practical advice. So I think that's the first thing. I think the second thing is I think I regularly sit down and go, okay, what is it I want to be? Am I achieving what I want to achieve? And the answer, if the answer is yes, fantastic. Maybe you're making refinements, but always be honest with yourself about what you're doing at this moment in time, because it's quite easy to fall into a cycle, you get comfortable, but deep down this isn't kind of right. And having that honesty, and sometimes just literally taking a day, go for a walk and go, what do I want to be doing with my life? Am I happy with what I'm doing? Do I think it's impactful, etc.? Is, I think, very, very, very useful. Third thing is you've got to, I think, you can get so much advice.
Yeah.
Does it contradict the first two? But you can get advice from 100 people, right? And they'll tell you 100 different things. They're not living your life, right? Number one. And they are coming at it from different perspectives. So I think there's a delicate balance between listening to people and getting their advice, but also being prepared to go, look, that's useful contextual information, but my gut says I'm going to do this thing. And you've got to kind of do it. Otherwise, you could be paralyzed into not doing anything. And so that for me is important. The final thing is, and it speaks to your point about being a future Lewis Irwin, you are you, right? Like there is no, I'm not a big fan of pegging achievements to particular people and going, okay, this person did this at this age, I need to do this thing, or this particular person followed this path. I think I'm a believer that you can create your own path. And you have to kind of, as long as you know what you eventually want to be doing, and as soon as you've got a hunch that going down one particular path will help you get there, I'm not sure it's that helpful, studying LinkedIn and, ruthlessly trying to copy what someone else is doing. I think it can actually be quite harmful.
How so?
Well, I think you can sort of almost paralyze yourself by going, this person did this absolute thing, which may be unique to that person, right? They may have worked at this organization or in this field, and they may do it. One of the things I think is absolutely essential in life is you absolutely have to love the thing if you're in a position to love the thing that you're doing, you can do it, you can be the best in the world at that, right? And if you don't, it can be quite, if you don't, you don't know why you're doing it, or you don't enjoy it and you're slogging it out, it's not the greatest feeling in the world. So for me, you could get led down a path that really isn't your path. So, live your own life at your own pace, and you've got to hope that things will work out. But if you've got, this is why I mentioned the first part, if you've got that group of people, family and friends and networks that can help, broadly speaking, keep you on the right path, and if you're asking yourself the question, am I on the right path regularly enough, hopefully you'll be on the right path, independent of how long it takes or what X or Y is doing in your personal network. So a mix of practical and maybe a bit more principles based, but for me that's what's guided me, and it's been immensely helpful.
I love that, particularly given that we often ignore what we shouldn't do, and I think sometimes in order to make a choice you also have to consider what are the wrong choices and the bad choices, and what might be decisions which lead to a worse result. I'm just aware that we are over this. I was about to start and open a conversation about politics, the fact that people are choosing their paths, and which path do you choose? Politician, social entrepreneur, lawyer, debater, but we'll have to discuss that for the next series. I just want to say a huge thank you to you for being here. I've learned so much from you, and I've learned things which I never knew about you, so I really appreciate you being very open and honest, but also kind of sharing a lot of true wisdom and experience and lessons and learnings which are going to be so valuable to our students who want to kind of follow in your footsteps. So thank you for your time, and do you have any final words before we go?
No, I'm just, the only thing is to say, good luck, look after yourself. It can be tough trying to change the world. Don't be too harsh on yourself, but if you surround yourself with good people and you keep yourself honest and you make time to reflect and take in the outside world, I think you're already on the right path. So best of luck.
Thanks, Lewis. Please, keep on doing what you're doing. We are watching and we are being inspired, and it means a lot to folk, particularly from people from Newham and people of colour and others like myself who see you as a peer and keep on being inspired. So thank you for your time.
Thank you very much.
This educational content is absolutely free. Why? Because our vision is a world where anybody, no matter their background, can learn how to make a difference. To keep going, we need your help. Can you become our next patron? Can you help us reach 2,500 patrons? I really hope so. Whatever the case, hope you learned something today, and sending you peace and love. Let's keep learning.